Hi, my name is Tala Ali Hassan, and you're listening to the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcast.
Welcome to the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts. My name is Sidhant Wadhera, and I am the production manager for The Main Page, our podcast on policy, politics, and current affairs. For today's episode, I discuss the topic of subnational authoritarianism with Professor Robert Mickey. A quick note before we begin. This episode was recorded remotely due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. We had some technical issues during the recording, so please accept my apologies for occasional dips in sound quality. Without further ado, here is Professor Rob Mickey. Welcome to the UC3P main page. My name is Sidhant Wadhera, and today I'm speaking to Dr. Robert Mickey. Dr. Mickey is an associate professor of political science at the University of Michigan. Dr. Mickey, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
I've asked you on today to discuss the topic of subnational authoritarianism and to understand it in the historical American context. So, to begin, can you define subnational authoritarianism for the audience?
Sure. So, and the way people usually think about it is just taking however we conceptualize democracy and then applying that to subnational jurisdictions. So that could be Illinois or Cook County or Chicago. So then the main thing is, well, how do we define democracy? And as I'm sure you know, political scientists have a kind of a depressing low bar conception of democracy, right? It's a minimal proceduralist definition. So it's not a country that does smart things or does nice things or a polity that's necessarily just, but one that really mainly just features something like universal suffrage, something like free and fair elections, and the rule of law. And as long as at the national level, a country meets those criteria, we usually call it democratic. Now, it's also useful to not just think in binary terms, right? Democratic or not, authoritarian or not, but to think about how democraticness. Is Norway probably more democratic than the U.S. is? Yeah. Are they both democracies? Yeah. But so for subnational authoritarianism, in terms of like which provinces or states or cities are authoritarian, we're thinking about countries that are at the national level democratic, but have these pockets of authoritarian rule inside. And just one more thing, those are pretty common in federal countries, right? So if you think about countries that are federal, they're usually larger. Mexico, Brazil, Argentina are all federal. All of them have pockets or provinces, states that are run in the old way, right? Even though the country is itself has kind of democratized since the 1980s. I used to say that about Russia, but it's not even democratic at the national level anymore. Yeah, so it's not that uncommon a phenomenon.
A significant part of your work explores desegregation in the American South as a transition from authoritarian rule. Can you expand on that idea and how it relates to subnational authoritarianism?
Sure. Well, I guess I wouldn't say desegregation, but I would say suffrage restriction and desegregation, right? Those are the two main components of the Jim Crow South. African Americans and many poor whites being kicked out of the electorate, an electorate they participated in massive numbers in the 19th century. So suffrage restriction plus these kind of massive restrictions on civil rights and civil liberties, states mandating that the public sphere be racially segregated and so on. Yeah, so I think about Southern states from the 1890s until about 1970 as being stable authoritarian regimes at the subnational level. So when I mean stable, I don't just mean after Reconstruction, there was a lot of violence and chaos and insecure voting rights, but actually the kind of political achievement, not one we would like, right? But the political achievement of the development of stable authoritarian polities, but at the state level. So South Carolina being one, Mississippi, Georgia, North Carolina, and so on.
How does the desire to entrench white hegemony impact or affect the authoritarian nature of the state in this context that you're talking about?
In my view, these states became authoritarian principally for economic reasons. Racism, white supremacy, white hegemony, however you want to think about it, can survive and thrive in any kind of political system. A democracy like ours, a fully authoritarian system like the pre-Civil War South, 1930 Mississippi, whatever, right? So for me, what is critical, why these things developed, is because large landowners realized, and this is true of authoritarians all around the world today and in the past as well, large landowners realizing that democracy is going to be bad for their economic interests, right? And especially large landowners, right? People who own immobile assets have more reason to fear the taxation of the wealthy that they reasonably expect to follow on the heels of the majority of the people getting the power to vote and set policy. This is something that, Professor Robinson at the Harris School has worked on a lot, right? And, his work is particularly on what are the conditions under which would-be democratizers can credibly commit to authoritarians that they're not going to tax them into oblivion. And short of getting a credible, a believable promise from would-be democratizers, the authoritarians continue to repress and prevent democracy. Right. So for me, what was really distinctive about the American South then and now is not that it's more racist than other parts of the country, although that's true, right? It's that economic interests were aligned such that these large plantation owners and other large landowners really, really feared universal suffrage at that time, universal male suffrage, and multi-party competition. And so they shut the door to those things in the 20, 25 years after Reconstruction after they defeated Reconstruction. It's worth keeping in mind, and we can talk about more if you wish, that there's usually a political party in the United States that's more hostile to racial equality. And for the vast majority of American history, that's been the Democratic Party, a party that began as the world's first mass-based political party in the 1820s but was a national party that really saw its job as guaranteeing white supremacy into the post-World War II period. Yeah, so these were authoritarian states that were ruled by politicians in the Democratic Party.
So I want to get back to that. We will in a little bit. Part of authoritarianism is that a single party or a single polity has the dominant force of violence in a state. Would that be accurate?
The Weberian idea of a state having a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. I mean, I think there are lots of regimes out around the world that where the state doesn't have a monopoly on violence that we would consider not democracies, but certainly, you're right, stable authoritarian regimes do a good job of controlling the means of violence. Certainly in these cases too, yeah.
But the reason why I'm asking that is because there seems to be an interplay between state-sanctioned acts of violence. I'm thinking things like Bull Connor in Birmingham attacking protesters violently, and then unsanctioned acts of terror like the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. So what is that interplay between the state-sanctioned, stable authoritarian acts of violence and then acts of violence that seem to be aligned at the same goal of maintaining the authoritarian regime, but are outside of that Weberian idea of state monopoly on violence?
Right. Or some of this private violence, we might say, I don't think had exactly the goals in mind of maintaining the current order. But at the same time, they weren't democratic either. So you're exactly right. So in the South, from the period after Reconstruction until really the 1970s, you have a combination of a lot of repression by state actors, So as you said, that could be police officers, although we have that today in a country we consider democratic too. But a lot of violence committed with impunity, although we have that too today, by county sheriffs, by police officers, by state highway patrols or whatever. But at the same time, back then, a lot of violence that was also seemingly not sponsored by the state, like violence by the Klan. And this is a very tangled up and interesting relationship. Sometimes what seemed like violence in, say, the 19 teens or 20s by the Klan was itself state organized or sponsored, right? It might seem like it's only the Klan involved, but there are people running for governor who are doing the organizing, or even sitting officials, right? People are already in office. There are even times as long ago as back then where these authoritarian officials at the state level, public officials, public authorities, were very upset by private violence committed by the Klan. And again, often for economic reasons, right? They worried a lot about states, their states developing reputations as too disorderly as a place to do business, a place that other people wouldn't want to invest in, while at the same time, yes, they're using local and county law enforcement to deter people from trying to vote. Often they would try to deter or even repress violence committed by angry white men running around on horseback. So this relationship was often very complicated. Even into the 1960s, you have public officials who are highly repressive of, at the exact same time, Black protesters who I would consider like democratizing actors, right? And also deterring and repressing white mob violence at the same time, because they thought they increasingly valued external foreign investment, and they realized that it was bad for business for fire bombings to occur all the time. So, and this is for those of you who are listening, or for you if you study comparative politics, this dynamic is not, it sounds strange in the American context, but it's not at all unusual overseas, right? Of authoritarian leaders trying to strike the right balance between committing enough violence, or at least showing that they're able to commit enough violence that they deter troublemakers, but not committing so much of it that ends up leading to more headaches for them as public authorities.
I want to take a step back a little bit and talk about the role of the federal government. Earlier, you mentioned that subnational authoritarianism usually is seen in federal countries. The United States is a federal country. So what role did the federal government play in, I guess, first protecting and then eventually challenging the South as an authoritarian enclave?
Great question. Yeah, it's hard to imagine subnational authoritarianism without federalism, right? Why is that? Well, the real kind of, or at least one of the puzzles of subnational authoritarianism is, how could a country, especially a country that's a democracy, allow these pockets of authoritarian rule to coexist inside it? In other words, why would, roughly speaking, the North put up with this? After they go to all the trouble of losing a lot of their own boys in the Civil War, it's 1900. What's been replaced is authoritarian politics, Jim Crow segregation, plantation, quasi-slavery, and white-only voting. What do we do all that work for, right? Which is a good question, and that's exactly right. It's federalism that gives leaders at the state or local level enough autonomy to build politics the way they want it. Now, they have to get very lucky. So if you think about, in the case of American subnational authoritarians, they got very lucky in that the U.S. Supreme Court decided to treat as merely aspirational the 15th Amendment. One of the great three Reconstruction amendments, 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, the 15th Amendment seems to provide American men, at least, with a right to vote. It turns out it doesn't. It provides some restrictions on the ability of authorities to take away the vote. in certain circumstances, like in